Praise the Lord, guys. I'm Shaw Greenhorn. And it came to pass that they found him after 3 days in the temple, sitting in the midst of the doctors, both hearing them and asking them questions. And all that heard him were astonished at his understanding and answers. And when they saw him, they were amazed. And his mother said unto him, Son, why hast thou thus dealt with us? For thy father and I sought thee sorrowing. Jesus answered and said unto them, How is it that you sought for me? Wist ye not that I must be about my father's business? And they understood not the saying that he said unto them. So he went down with them and came to Nazareth, and was subject unto them. But his mother kept all these things laid up in her heart. And Jesus grew in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and man. So the conclusion here of the second chapter of Luke, we just saw where they went up to be to the feast of Passover up in Jerusalem. A continuation from yesterday's video. We see Jesus being left behind after the feast. And in this moment, we get to see a small preview of, just the wisdom, the spirit that God has made him to be. We know that in the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God, and the Word was God. And it's this Word that became flesh. And you've seen it here in the flesh. So now it's to be understood that, God was Jesus' teacher. Just like for John the Baptist. Some people in life, you'll meet them and they'll know certain things. We all, are blessed in different ways, when we leave God's table. But, Jesus, being the ultimate heir of all things. The Bible says that the heir, when he is a child, he differeth not from a servant, though he be Lord of all, but is under governors and tutors until the time appointed of the Father. We know that, Jesus himself said that, the Father had committed all judgment into his hands. So, understand the wisdom that it takes to walk, to be able to fulfill, such a role, having all judgment, in your hands. They say with much power comes much, responsibility. Heavy is the head that wears the crown. A lot of people, they look at glory in life and, they don't understand the weight that it took to get there. They don't understand the weight that it takes to stay there. All they see is the fame, the fans, the money, the possessions, the nice cars and houses, and all these, superficial things. But they don't see how that mind, works constantly, non-stop. It's like a machine, calculating, different scenarios, coming up with answers to things that haven't even happened yet. Reflecting, tying together all things, having it make sense. They say life is lived forward but understood backwards. So, the child Jesus, here we see a preview of, his really wisdom. Just because he's just speaking, he's not, doing any miracles in the temple. We know that his first miracle was turning the water into wine. And that's, to come way later. So, it's to, be understood that he's in the presence here of these, doctors. I imagine that, they're physicians, doctors of the law, doctors of even, the faith. With these learned men, they often enjoy such, stimulating discussions where, they challenge each other's, point of view. They introduce new theories to each other. And, they share as a collective group. Obviously, if it's something that they were working on, they could profit from, maybe they would keep it, secret until they could, bring it to pass so that, nobody steals their idea. But, the fact that he's in, the company of these men, being 12 years old, and him, being able to give these answers, it just shows you that his spirit is timeless. Been since before the creation of the world. Even the Revelation describes him and I beheld a lamb as it were, had been slain, from before the foundation of the world. Having, created all things. The wisdom, we always like to say that we sometimes are, always, overlook the wisdom with which God used to create things. Yeah, we know he spoke and things were, but, these things, they had to be calculated. They had to be designed. He had to create. I mean, if you think about, a basic atom, the proton, neutron and electrons, being the component of all things, pretty much. And how, he combined, different, properties of things to create, next level building blocks, each step of the way. And how he, brought these all together. God is wisdom, and we're seeing, a lot of it here. We also see right here a moment of him, kind of stepping out, as a preview before his time. So we have two things that collide, together right here. This, preview that he's on right now with, the reality of what is his current situation. Him being a 12-year-old child, still subject to his parents. We see these two, collide head on, but, ultimately him humbling himself, because it was not his time as yet. We see him introduce such a statement that, wish ye not that, wist ye not that I must be about my father's business. We know prophecies were given by the angel, Gabriel, when he came to speak, unto them. So they know that he's the son of the highest. The shepherds came. We just saw Anna and Simeon of Jerusalem. They came with their prophecies. Elizabeth, the mother of John the Baptist, when, Mary came to visit her, she gave her also, so many confirming, proper prophecies about, Jesus' life. But I think that in the heat of the moment, on the commotion, them having, dealing with the fact that he was missing, not knowing if anything happened to him, responding with such a out of the blue statement. Now you can understand that, nobody on earth has ever made this statement before. I would go out on a limb and say that and have it have the meaning that, it obviously meant. Yeah, so this went over their head. So, in a moment here, we see a collision, really, like I said, of two different realities. In yesterday's video, I pointed it out that, it was only after his parents left that he was able, and for the very same reason we're seeing right here, him being subject unto them, and these, behaviors not being expected of him. And, us in this day that we live with all these, advances in theories, understanding the human mind, understanding just, having a mind to think and grow rich, having a mind to be able to hold, they say, the great mind is able to hold, conflicting thoughts, conflicting ideas that deny even each other, and they're still able to function. You see this, being presented to his parents, and they kind of shut down. And I guess the takeaway, is understand that, as a parent, it is your, job to mold and discipline and grow your child. But, make room for their greatness. Make room for their greatness so that when it does show up, you're not surprised by it. You don't feel the reaction to stomp it out, just like a knee-jerk reflex. Because one would take away from this that when his time, would come, that he would have to be able to separate from them so much, because the things that God was getting ready to do for him, it was too great for their, realities. As much as they were given all these prophecies, he is the son of the highest. The Lord his God shall give unto him the throne of his father David. He shall rule over the house of Jacob forever, and of his kingdom there shall be no end. And everything that was said about him. So 3 days it was said, after they lost him. 3 days. I would even, compare this, just to his, ministry in death. How he rested, 3 days, being separated from the Father, as he was separated from his parents right here. But it's what he did in these 3 days. How he went to hell and got, the keys to hell and death itself. Because if he didn't, finish this part of the journey, then all the things that he did would have just been fascinating stories. Because, we all would have been doomed anyways. So there's a lot of, symbolism here. All right, so how did we get here? Beginning from the 2nd chapter of Luke, we saw where, Caesar Augustus gave the decree under his governor, Cyrenius of Syria, that the world should be taxed, each man going up to be taxed. Joseph and his pregnant wife Mary, when they got there, that's where she did, had the child up in, the city of Bethlehem, the city of David, because he was of the household of David, of the tribe of Judah. Then we saw the 3 shepherds, the wise men. The angel appeared unto them, told them about the birth of the Savior, Christ the Lord. They went to see him, and when they saw him, then they, told all the prophecies about him, them returning with joy and gladness. Then we see his circumcision, them naming him, Mary doing her, cleansing according to the law of the Lord, offering the offering, pair of turtle doves or 2 young pigeons. Then we see a side story of, Simeon of Jerusalem, just a devout man who was prophesied that he would not die before seeing the Christ. And we saw him, come face to face with the child. He blessed the child, gave his mother and father some prophecies. Then we see the introduction of Anna, the prophetess, another, righteous person who God allowed to see his son. Both of them being so old. So then we fast forward to here, to where Jesus is 12. And, we get this story from the point of view of the feast of Passover, which is, kept at Jerusalem. All right, so those scriptures, it started out saying, now his parents went up each year to Jerusalem at the feast of Passover. And when he was 12 years old, they went up to Jerusalem after the custom of the feast. Now when the days were accomplished, as they returned, the child Jesus tarried behind in Jerusalem. Joseph and his mother Mary, knew not of it. And they, supposing him to have been in the company, journeyed for a day. And then they sought him amongst their kinsfolk and acquaintance. And when they found him not, they returned to Jerusalem seeking him. And then we pick up right here. And it came to pass that after 3 days, they found him in the temple, sitting in the midst of the doctors, both hearing them and asking them questions. So, after being separated from him for 3 days, they come and they find him in the temple. Now, we understand that this was the end of the Passover, because it said that, when the time was accomplished, when all things were done, so now they're going home. So, these men, I imagine that the splendor is over, most families have departed. They're gone home. So these men are like the old wiser men, or the men of substance, intellectual substance. That I imagine that these guys that they ponder the deep things of life, because it's over, and it's time for everybody to go back home. But here they are, having these discussions. If you notice, there's different type of people. Like, for example, at a workplace, there's those that show up late and leave early. There's those that show up just when they're needed. But then there's those that they'll open the very doors and close them at night. These, they go the extra mile, and they're you can tell that they're seeking something deeper, not just the surface level stuff, but they're out for something more. So I believe that he is in the company of these men. Jesus, he's led by the Holy Ghost. I would not say that this was by accident. Maybe it was just an encouragement to the child, because look at such a life that has been chosen out for him. A lot of this is isolation. Not being a part of the in crowd. We have such a strong drive, to be a part of the group. But he's being reserved for such a much greater purpose. So this can be seen as a gauge to the child, to let him see where he's come from and who he is. Just how much wiser than these men, and he is so much younger. So I believe that part of this was a encouragement to himself. Is that, look at you compared to them, and they're so much older. They are the ones that know everything, and they can't even begin to ask the questions that you're asking. They can't even begin to make the thoughts that you are having. So you see, son, it's not in vain, I believe the father was saying to him in this moment. Now, ever since the Old Testament, it was given, Passover would be held in the city that God had chosen, which ended up being Jerusalem. So, all the tribes from all of Israel, they all had to come to Jerusalem. Now, imagine so many people fitting, in there. I imagine that not everybody could fit inside the temple. There had to be different locations, set up just so that everybody could have a seat, at a table. Because I mean, the sheer number of people that would be there. But now here we find this encounter happening inside the temple. So sitting in the midst of these doctors, the highest level of education that you can find pretty much anywhere in the world. But obviously they did not have the technologies that we have today. Theories were way lesser, I would say. In those days, bleeding, anything was wrong with a person, they bled them. That was one of their main things. The study of the four humors. I mean, they did the best that they could. Knowledge was really, exchanging of, ideas and experience and encounters, and theories, among these men. They could correct each other, refine, each other's, theories based on their experience, and the whole group, learning as a whole. So we see him here, hearing them and asking them questions. So, him being the God of all creation. Humility again, right? Because otherwise, he would have sat them down, right? And just taught them. I mean, that time is coming, but that's when he's, older and doing his ministry. So, asking them questions, really. I see him right here, getting the wheels to turn inside their minds, getting them to consider things they hadn't considered before, getting them to connect things to each other that they were not able to do on their own. It's like being an overseer, but not as obvious. All right, so the next verse says, and all that heard him were astonished at his understanding and answers. So, at one point he said, I do the things always that I see my father do. Him seeing the things that his father does. How much wisdom do you think one would get from, observing that on a day-to-day basis? What kind of thoughts you think will come out of a person's mouth? What kind of vision would they have? What kind of ideas would be, in their mind? So, sitting in the company of these men, you would understand that at some point he was just there, right? And they were talking. Then he asked the first question. And then he maybe gave some, but then he asked another question or made another statement. Then, he made another one. And then, after some time, they would notice that, all right, so we're going to, look at this young man right here. And then, him giving more time to speak. So, they went from seeing him just as a little child, just really observing the older men, then to, okay, all right, so we got a sharp one here. And then, like, wow, look at this guy, to then just looking at him, and then fixing their gaze on him and coming to the understanding that, there's something about this child right here. And I imagine that as he spoke, they would get more quiet, There would even come a point where they would stop looking at each other to say, are you seeing what I'm seeing? Are you hearing what I'm hearing? And they were just captivated by him. So those that heard him, they were astonished at his understanding and answers. So, understanding being the reason why things are the way they are. You guys have this theory that, XYZ, but do you actually know that it's because of this reason Now you might think that it's because of that other reason, but no, it's because of this one. Being able to dissect, really. His understanding, being able to dissect and remove out, core that, it just so happens to fit in place, but it's not the best answer. It's not the best, the most complete theory, but it does fit. And as long as things, stay the way they are and it doesn't get too complicated, then you can get by with this. But then, he would, dissect this thing and remove, that other part, and then, give them what they really needed to go there. So his understanding, the finer points, the nitty gritty, and then his answers. So they were, astonished at his understanding and answers. Now the answers would be the things that they don't have, theories to. This is not having, an incomplete like core inside of, something, but rather that they just don't know and they can only speculate, but they haven't really. It's either they don't know completely or they don't have enough, to stand on it strong and to say, okay, so we suspect that it might be this. So his answers is giving them something where they have nothing, as opposed to, fine tuning, being understanding. All right, so the next verse says, and when they found him, they were amazed. But his mother said unto him, Son, how is it ye have thus dealt with us? Know ye not that your father and I sought for you sorrowing? So now, this must be such a scene. Because here he is sitting with these men, having them in full attention, in full, awe. And this is the Son of God. Yeah, this is not some, child prodigy that's good at math or the piano. This is the understanding of all things. Music, art, biology, chemistry, physics, geography, technology, everything. And to see his mother, come in on this emotion. Now remember, they were looking for him for 3 days. Don't forget, 3 days. The Son of God. How did you lose the Son of God? What's gonna happen if we can't find him? No doubt he is God's son, so God, no doubt, would be able to find him. But she's running in with this motherly energy, and we don't see Joseph saying anything. Or maybe he did and it just wasn't recorded. So when they saw him, they were amazed. So interrupting the whole thing going on. Now I imagine that these men, they're just sitting there looking, because they have now become an audience, and this is just another show for them. Now remember, when he was just born, and the three shepherds came, they had made it known abroad to the region about everything that was, prophesied unto them when they brought him to present him before the Lord. All these prophecies. So this is just showing that all these things were true and that we're on the right track. But then you can ask the question. I would doubt if anybody was able to put two and two together that this is the same child that was receiving all this attention. Not even the disciples when they were with him. Everything that he told them, it went right over their head. They were not able to connect the dots in anything. And if they were not, I doubt that anybody else would. Here's just a child that is, full of all this, wisdom and insight. So when they saw him, they were amazed. They were happy to see him. He's safe. Everything's all right. And then the mother, we see her, speaking to him. How could you do this to us? Do you not know that we sought for you sorrowing? A mom being a mom, really imagining the worst. What would have happened if they didn't, to find him when they turned back? Would he have known how to make it home? So them seeking for him sorrowing is, imagining the worst. Their imagination is getting the best of them. And so the next one says, but he answered and said unto them, how is it that you sought for me sorrowing? Wish ye not that I must be about my father's business? So now here is where we have the collision of these two realities. Him being this child, in the eyes of his parents, but him being the Son of God, in this audience of, men and doctors that he is, speaking onto currently. And he's carrying this energy over, onto his mother. So, in this moment, we can see that this is the Ancient of Days, as he is called, talking. Sometimes things come out too soon and you got to pull it back a little bit. So how is it that you sought for me, sorrowing? Do you not understand my mission? You were told everything, why I was sent here, who I am, my mission, what I'm coming here to do. So wish ye not that I must be about my father's business. In this moment, he makes them understand that, although he is their child, that he is really God's child. God's will comes first. And you guys are looking at me through the wrong lens. He's letting know that he's not here to play. That's what I really see him saying. I'm not here to play. I'm not here to live up to what you guys expect of me. My father's business. The things of this, world that are expected. Not something from that, point of view, but from the unknown will of God, the unknown purpose of God. These scribes and Pharisees has, strayed so far from. So, and he's also saying, did you not even for 1 second even imagine or even try to reason that there must be a reason why I am missing from you guys' company. So you're seeking for me sorrowing because you think that the world is one way, and you're so convinced about it that you're able to show such a strong negative emotion, this sorrowing, when you're missing the whole point. Do you not even consider that I'm on the reason why I was sent here? And like I said in the last video, maybe he had to be separated from them to see this, side of himself. Because, being subjected unto them, he answers their questions, right? He answers their reality, their frame. They don't know the will of God. They don't know the plan of God. They don't know the words of God, the design of God. It's not like they can guide him into these things. And as long as, he's under their, scrutiny, as long as he's under, their forward eyebrow, he has to, say goodbye to these things. All right, so the next one says, but he went down with them and came to Nazareth and was subject unto them. But his mother kept all these things in her heart. So here we have him, reframing himself, because, ultimately he couldn't just run off and be a man. It wasn't his time yet. He couldn't just run off and just started doing, these things. He has some, some distance yet to go. So he went down with them in their company and was subject unto them, which shows you that him being subject unto them was different than him, operating in this kind of, state of, mind, state of thinking, reasoning, understanding and being. I think a real world example is like when a child is crossing over, like from being such a young, younger child until where they're trying to get integrated in amongst their peers and to stand independently. How they'll not want the parents around, and they'll be embarrassed by the parents. That's because the parents, they come with a certain expectation, a certain frame, and they've been this all their life. Growing up with their parents, and in order for them to be a part of their social group, they have to break away from this. So he subjected himself unto them, meaning that, like I said, this moment he was not subject unto them, and you can tell even by his answer. But he remembered respect, he remembered humility, and we see his mother, laying up these things in her heart. Yet once again, if we were to count the number of times she had laid, things up in her heart so far, when the shepherds came to see him when he was just born in the manger, and they made known, everything that was said, she laid, these things up in her heart. Simeon of Jerusalem, when he came and gave her all the prophecies, she laid, these things up in her heart. So this is the third time we see this phrase being used. So this is when she ponders on this when she's alone. I imagine not when her husband is around. Whatever time of day that she's by herself, she thinks on these things. What it must mean. She was directly given these prophecies. So it should not be a hard connection. But rather somewhere to leave her, amazement, understanding that she was given the Son of God to care for. All right, so the last one says, and the child Jesus grew in wisdom, stature, and in favor with God and men. So he's continuing to grow in wisdom, understanding the things of life, how things work together, how they're connected, how each thing functions independently, understanding the overall picture as well as the how the pieces fit together, understanding each individual piece, understanding where he came from, who he is. So wisdom, being able to really see all things, connected, in ways that people haven't seen before or thought of before. And God fed him this wisdom, wisdom and stature, rising in rank. You understand that it takes a certain rank to do the miracles that he did. So, when he turned the water into wine, know that he had been climbing, for some time, so that when that came around, he was able to do it. And favor with God and men. Now, this is a really unusual, instance, because usually with favor with God, comes at the cost of favor with men. And favor with men comes at the cost of, favor with God. But, while he is, not so much a threat to the scribes and Pharisees, not yet, things are going smooth. But then, what comes later? He's going to be such an eyesore to them. But then, the multitude, they still loved him. I'm Straw Greenhorn.